Hey everyone, and thanks for joining me. Grab a snack, buckle up, and prepare yourselves for a trip along the fringes of reality itself. Are you sure you're ready for 3 more terrifying late-night drive stories? Let's roll. Number 1, House of God. It was a dark and stormy night, the kind that made people stay indoors, but not for one man. His name was John, and he was driving on a deserted road in the middle of nowhere. John was a businessman, and he had just finished an important meeting with a client in a nearby town. It was now past midnight, and he was rushing to get back home to his family. As John drove on the empty road, he began to feel uneasy. Rain was pouring down hard, and the wind was howling, causing the trees to sway back and forth ominously. He had never been a fan of driving at night, especially on unfamiliar roads, but he had no choice currently. He turned on the radio to distract himself, but the only station he could pick up was static. Suddenly, John saw a figure in the distance standing right in the middle of the road. He hit the brakes, but it was too late. He slammed into the figure with a loud thud, and his car screeched to a halt. John's heart was racing as he got out of his car to see who or what he had hit. He could barely see through the rain, but he could make out a dark figure lying on the ground. John was hesitant to approach this figure, but he knew he had to, and as he got closer, he realized that it was a man that was covered in blood. John felt his stomach turn as he saw the man's lifeless eyes staring back at him. He panicked and quickly got back into his car, determined to call for help, but as he reached for his phone, he realized that he had no signal. John began to feel trapped and alone in the middle of nowhere. Suddenly, he heard a faint sound coming from the back of his car. It sounded like someone tapping on a window. John's heart skipped a beat as he turned around, but he saw nothing. He tried to shake off the feeling of dread and continue driving. However, the tapping sound persisted, growing louder and more frequent. John could no longer ignore it and looked back again only to see a pair of glowing eyes staring at him through the darkness. His hands began to tremble on the steering wheel as he realized that he was not alone. The car suddenly started to shake violently, and John felt as though he was being pulled in all directions. He tried to turn the wheel to regain control, but it was as if something was holding him back. John's eyes widened as he saw the silhouette of a figure in the rearview mirror, and he knew that it was not human. He screamed and hit the gas pedal, trying to escape the terrifying entity. The car picked up speed, but the creature seemed to be getting closer, its glowing eyes fixated on him. John's heart was pounding so hard that he thought it would burst out of his chest. He knew he had to do something, anything to survive. It was just then that John remembered a nearby church he had passed on his way to the meeting. He made a dangerously sharp turn and headed towards it, hoping that he would find refuge within. As he pulled up to the church, this creature disappeared, and the car came to a sudden stop. John let out a sigh of relief and got out of the car, looking back to see if the creature was still following him, but he saw nothing, only the darkness of the night. He hastily entered the church, seeking shelter and safety. However, he soon realized that he had made a grave mistake. The church was empty, and the silence was deafening. John felt as though he was being watched by someone or something. Suddenly, he heard a faint whisper coming from the shadows, and he knew that again, he was not alone. He tried to run, but his legs felt heavy, as if someone or something was holding them back. The encompassing whispers grew louder, and John felt as though he was surrounded by the darkness itself. Suddenly, the candles in the church lit up, revealing a group of hooded figures standing before him. John's heart sank as he realized that he had stumbled upon a cult ritual. The figures began chanting in an unknown language, and John felt as though he was being pulled towards them, as if they were trying to sacrifice him. He tried to fight back, but his limbs felt even weaker, as if he was under a spell. The cult members started to approach him, their faces obscured by the hoods. John felt his body being lifted off of the ground, and he knew that he was going to be sacrificed to whatever dark deity they worshipped. As he closed his eyes, ready to accept his fate, he felt a sudden jolt. He then opened his eyes to find himself back in his car on that same deserted road. It was still dark and stormy, but the cult and the creature were nowhere to be seen. John couldn't believe what had just happened. Was it all a nightmare? He looked at the clock on the dashboard and realized that he had been driving for hours, even though it felt like only a few minutes. John continued his journey back home, eager to be reunited with his family, but the events of that night would haunt him forever. He never spoke of what happened to anyone, feeling that no one would really believe him anyways, but every time he drove at night from that point forward, he couldn't shake off the feeling that he was being watched and that the darkness was alive, waiting to consume him. Number 2, Through the Darkness. It was well past midnight, and Lily was still driving on this deserted country road. She had been on the road for hours, but she was no closer to reaching her destination than she was when she'd first started. Her headlights illuminated the winding path ahead, but beyond that, everything was pitch black. Lily had heard rumors about these back roads, about the ghostly apparitions that appeared to drivers late at night. She tried to push those thoughts out of her mind and focus on the road, but the oppressive silence of night made it impossible. Suddenly, Lily saw something in the distance, a figure standing in the road. She slowed down, trying to make out what it was, and as she drew closer, she could see that it was a person, a man dressed in old-fashioned clothing, who looked lost and disoriented, as if he'd been wandering for hours. Lily hesitated for a moment, then decided to stop and offer him a ride. She opened the passenger door, and the man climbed in, his eyes darting nervously around the car. Thanks, he said, his voice shaking. I've been waiting for hours. I thought I was never going to find anyone. Lily smiled sympathetically. It's no problem. Do you need a ride somewhere? The man hesitated, and then said, just keep driving. I'll tell you where to go. Lily started the car and continued down the dark road. The man was quiet, his eyes fixated on the passing scenery, and though she tried to maintain small talk, he seemed distracted and uninterested. As they drove on, Lily began to feel uneasy. There was something about this man that didn't sit right to her. He seemed out of place, like he didn't belong in this time or even on this world. Suddenly, the man spoke up. Turn left here, he said, pointing down a narrow dirt road. Lily hesitated, but then turned the car down the road. The man directed her down a series of winding paths until they came to a small clearing, and then got out of the car and walked towards the woods, beckoning Lily to follow. She hesitated in nervousness for a moment, but then curiosity got the best of her, and she stepped out of the car and followed him into the darkness. As they walked deeper and deeper into the woods in silence, the man's demeanor changed. He became agitated and more nervous, his eyes darting around as if he were being watched. Lily started to feel uneasy, but she kept following him regardless, unable to shake the feeling that she was maybe being led into a trap. Suddenly, the man stopped in his tracks, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. Lily strained to see what it was, but all she could make out was a dark figure in the shadows. The man turned to Lily, his face pale with fear. "Run," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily didn't need to be told twice. She turned and ran back the way she had come from, her heart pounding out of her chest. She could hear footsteps behind her, but she didn't dare look back. As she emerged from the woods, she saw her car parked in the clearing, but the man was nowhere to be seen. She climbed into the driver's seat as quickly as possible and turned the key, but the car wouldn't start. She tried again and again, but the engine would not turn over. And that's when she heard it, the sound of footsteps getting closer and closer. She turned around and saw the man, his eyes glowing in the darkness, his body twisted and contorted into an unnatural shape. Lily screamed and tried to start the car again, but it was no use. The man was upon her now, his twisted and contorted form looming over her. His eyes bore into hers, filled with hatred and malice that she couldn't comprehend. Suddenly, Lily heard a voice in her head, a voice that wasn't her own. "You should have never come here," it said, cold and menacing. Lily felt a chill run down her spine. She tried to open the car door, but it was locked. She was trapped, with nowhere to go. The man reached out and touched her, and she felt a cold, clammy hand close around her throat. She struggled to breathe, to free herself, but the grip tightened, cutting off her air supply entirely. As Lily's vision started to fade, and she knew she was about to die, she closed her eyes and waited for the end. But then, she heard a sound that she couldn't explain. It was like a deep, guttural roar coming from deep within the woods. The man turned his head, his grip loosened for a moment, and Lily took the opportunity to open her car door and scramble out into the darkness. She ran as fast as she could, not daring to look back. Again, she could hear the man's footsteps closing in behind her, but she kept running, driven by fear and desperation. Finally, she burst out of the woods and into a clear open space where she saw a car approaching. She sprinted towards it, waving her arms wildly and screaming for help. The car screeched to a halt, and the driver got out, looking at Lily with concern. She tried to explain what had happened, but she just couldn't find the words. The driver then led her to his car and offered to drive her to safety. As they sped away, Lily looked back at the woods, half expecting to see the man's twisted form lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing there, just the darkness of night. Lily never forgot that experience, and she never drove on deserted country roads again, for she knew what was out there, things that couldn't be explained, things that were best left alone. Number 3. Breakdown. It was a cold and damp night, and Mike found himself stranded on the side of the road. His car had quit working, and he had no way of getting home. He had no other choice but to hitchhike. He stuck out his thumb, hoping that someone would pick him up. He had never hitchhiked before, but he had heard that it was dangerous. He tried to ignore the feeling of unease that crept over him as he stood there, alone on this deserted road. Suddenly, a car pulled up beside him. The driver rolled down the window, and Mike saw that it was an elderly man with a crooked smile. "Need a ride, son?" the old man asked. Mike hesitated, but he was desperate to get home. He climbed into the car and thanked the man. The car was weathered and smelled like must, but Mike was just grateful for the ride. The old man started to talk, telling Mike about his life and how he used to be a truck driver, and Mike tried to make polite conversation, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this man. As they drove, the rain started to pour down in sheets, making it hard to see out of the windows. The old man's driving became erratic, and Mike realized that they were going much too fast. "Hey, slow down," Mike said, his voice shaking, but the old man ignored him, laughing maniacally as he drove. Mike started to panic. He didn't know where they were going or what the old man was planning, and he didn't like it. Suddenly, the old man turned down a dark, narrow road that led deep into the woods. Mike tried to open the door, but it was locked from the outside. He was effectively trapped. The old man pulled up to a rundown cabin and turned off the engine. He turned to Mike, his eyes gleaming with a strange light. "I have a proposition for you," the old man said. Mike's heart sank. He knew he was in trouble. He tried to get out of the car desperately, but the old man grabbed his arm, holding him in place. "You're not going anywhere," the old man said, his grip tightening. Mike struggled with all of his might, but he was no match for the old man's strength. And in that moment, he realized that he was going to have to fight his way out of this. He punched, pushed, and scratched at the old man until he was stunned, and then seized the opportunity to roll down the window, crawl out, and run toward the woods, his heart racing with fear. He could hear the old man's crazy laughter echoing through the trees as he ran deeper and deeper into the woods. Mike had no idea where he was going, but he just knew that he had to keep moving, no matter what. At this point, the rain had soaked through his clothing, and he was shivering from the cold. He heard something moving behind him, and he turned around, fully expecting to see the old man, but what he saw in stalk was far worse. A tall, lanky figure was walking towards him, its eyes glowing in the darkness, and an unnaturally large and wicked smile revealing razor-sharp teeth. Mike froze, unable to move. This creature was unlike anything he'd ever seen before. It inched closer, its red eyes staring directly into his soul. Mike knew he had to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was paralyzed with fear, unable to do anything but stare right back at this creature. Then, the creature let out a deafening screech, and Mike finally found the strength to move. He turned and ran as fast as he could, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know exactly how long he ran, but eventually he collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. He looked up, and to his horror, he saw the creature standing right in front of him. It reached out its long, bony arm and grabbed Mike by the shoulder. Its grip was icy cold, and Mike could feel its breath on his face. Again, the creature's eyes seemed to bore directly into his soul, and he felt a sense of pure terror wash over him. Suddenly, the creature spoke in a deep, guttural voice that seemed to reverberate through the trees. "You shouldn't have run," it said. "Now you belong to me." Mike tried to fight back, but the creature was too strong. It dragged him deeper and deeper into the woods toward a hidden cave that Mike had never seen before. As they entered this cave, Mike could feel the temperature dropping. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something else he couldn't quite identify, possibly blood. The creature threw him onto the ground like a doll, and Mike could feel the cold, hard stone against his skin. He tried to crawl away, but the creature was too quick. It towered over him, its red eyes glowing in the darkness, and Mike could see those razor-sharp teeth gleaming in the dim light. "You humans are so weak," it said. You think you can control everything, but you are nothing. You are nothing compared to us. Mike felt a cold hand on his forehead, and he knew that the creature was going to kill him. He closed his eyes and waited for the inevitable, but then something strange happened. The creature's grip loosened, and Mike could hear a low growl emanating from its throat. He opened his eyes and saw the creature was staring off into the distance, its attention diverted, and without thinking, Mike scrambled to his feet and ran toward the cave entrance, not daring to look back. He ran for what felt like hours, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the creature's footsteps behind him, but he didn't stop running until he saw the lights of a town in the distance. He stumbled into the first bar he saw, panting and shaking with fear. The patrons looked at him in surprise, but he didn't care. He just wanted to get away from that thing. Mike told everyone what happened, but no one believed him. They laughed and joked, thinking he was crazy, but in his heart, he knew what he'd seen, and he knew that he would never forget that night for as long as he lived. From that day on, Mike never hitchhiked again. He accepted that the world was full of dangers that he couldn't even begin to comprehend. And worst of all, he knew that creature was still out there, waiting for its next victim. Thanks for joining us for this collection of scary late-night drive stories. If you enjoyed hearing my diabolical diatribes, subscribe to the channel, like this upload, and share us with anyone you feel deserves a good scare. Until next time.